My grandfather had just been lowered into the ground 3 days earlier when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I was washing out his favorite coffee mug, the chipped blue one with the faded lighthouse on it that he'd used every single morning for 30 years when I saw the text from my brother. "We're in Bali. Don't wait up." I set the mug down very slowly and smiled, because I'd already moved the $210,000 the day before his flight. You have to understand something about my grandfather, Harold, and the house he left behind. The lake house on Crescent Cove wasn't just a property on a deed. It was the place where I learned to read, curled up in the window seat that overlooked the water. It was where my grandmother baked apple cake every Sunday until she passed, and where my grandfather kept going to that same window seat every Sunday after she was gone, eating store-bought apple cake alone because he refused to let anyone else bake it. That house was 4 bedrooms of memory, a sagging dock, a detached garage full of vintage cars he'd spent 40 years restoring, and a savings account he'd quietly built for decades to make sure the property stayed in the family. He'd told me this himself, sitting across from me at his kitchen table 6 months before his diagnosis came back worse than anyone expected. "Maya," he'd said, pushing a manila folder across to me, "I need the person who actually understands this stuff to be in charge of it. I'm a paralegal at an estate law firm, have been for 6 years." My grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he named me executor. My brother did not appreciate that decision. My brother is 4 years older than me, which means he spent our entire childhood interpreting that gap as a permanent authority he'd never actually earned. He's charming in the way that people who've never faced real consequences are charming: big laugh, easy smile, a gift for making every room feel like it revolves around him. His wife, who he married 8 years ago in a ceremony that somehow managed to be both lavish and last minute, has exactly the same quality. Together, they are relentlessly, exhaustingly fun at dinner parties. Together, in private, they are a financial disaster held together with credit card debt and selective memory. I watched them for years. I watched my brother borrow money from our grandfather for a business venture that lasted 4 months. I watched his wife convince my grandfather that the antique sideboard in his dining room had been promised to her, a promise no one else had ever heard, and walk out with it during a holiday visit. I watched them show up at the lake house every summer, use it for 2 weeks, and then vanish for the other 50. I watched my grandfather make excuses for them with the infinite patience of a man who believed in family more than the evidence warranted. After the diagnosis, things shifted. My grandfather's dementia came on gradually, which is somehow worse than suddenly, because there's a long stretch of time where the person you love is still mostly there, but the edges are softening. He'd repeat things. He'd lose words mid-sentence. He'd look at you sometimes with a flicker of uncertainty, like he was trying to place your face in a catalog that kept rearranging itself. My brother started calling more often. That was the first sign. He called with questions about the lake house. How was the roof holding up? Had Grandpa thought about updating the will recently? Was the savings account still at the same bank? He framed all of it as concern, just checking in, just making sure everything was being handled. His wife started sending my grandfather cards, actual paper cards with handwritten notes, which she'd never done once in 8 years of holidays. I noticed. My grandfather was touched. He started saying things like, "Your brother's really stepping up, isn't he?" And I would smile and say, "He really is, Grandpa," because I didn't want to spend whatever time we had left on this. My grandfather passed on a Tuesday in October. The lake house was quiet and golden, and the leaves were coming down off the birches the way they always did, in that slow, spiraling descent that made the whole yard look like it was breathing. My husband, who had taken time off work to be there with me, held my hand through the entire afternoon. My brother arrived 2 hours after the hospice nurse left. His wife was right behind him, already looking around the house with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. They stayed for 5 days. During those 5 days, my brother made several interesting requests. He asked if we could postpone the probate filing, just temporarily, to give the family time to grieve without bureaucracy. I said I understood the sentiment, but the timeline was important, and we'd proceed as scheduled. He asked if he could have access to the savings account to cover some immediate estate expenses. I said all estate expenses would flow through me as executor, as my grandfather had specified. He asked whether it made more sense, practically speaking, to list the lake house now while the market was strong rather than hold it. I said the terms of the will were clear, and the property was to remain in the family. After each of these conversations, my brother would nod and say, of course, and within 20 minutes I'd hear him on the phone in the back bedroom, his voice low and careful. I'm a paralegal. I know what people sound like when they're exploring options. The night before they left, his wife found me alone in the kitchen. She had this way of entering a room that was specifically designed to make you feel like you'd both just happened to end up there by accident. She poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink and leaned against the counter and said, very casually, "You know, Maya, you've had such a weight on your shoulders with all this. It's so much to manage." I agreed that it was a lot. She said, "Honestly, if you ever want help with the accounts, with the paperwork, anything, we're here. You don't have to carry it all alone." I thanked her. She smiled. She left the water glass on the counter. I lay awake that night, going over every interaction in the last week, like a prosecutor reviewing transcripts. The requests about the account, the interest in the property listing, the offer to help with paperwork. And underneath all of it, something I'd been watching for 2 months, my brother's financial situation. I know more about it than he realizes. His wife mentioned their mortgage situation once at a family dinner 2 years ago, and I filed it away. A mutual friend mentioned a business deal that had gone badly. I'd seen credit card statements, accidentally, when we were both at the kitchen table and he'd left his email open on the shared laptop. I hadn't snooped, I'd just noticed. What I noticed was that they were not okay. They were the kind of not okay that looks fine from the outside but has been building underwater for years. My grandfather's estate was exactly the kind of thing that could solve their problem, or at least make them feel like it could. 3 days after they flew home, I got a call from the bank. Not just any bank, the bank where my grandfather had titled his cars, because he'd taken out a small loan against one of them years ago and paid it off, and the bank still had the account on file. The loan officer, who was clearly uncomfortable, told me that someone had visited the branch 2 days prior with a document claiming my grandfather had agreed, before his death, to use the '67 Mustang as collateral for a personal loan of $55,000. The document had my grandfather's signature on it. The loan officer had flagged it because the signature didn't match their records precisely, and because the document had been notarized at a UPS store in a town 2 hours away from where my grandfather had lived for 30 years. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my office and did not move for 4 minutes. Then I called my husband. I told him what the loan officer had told me. My husband, who is the most measured person I have ever met in my life, said nothing for a long moment and then said, "How do you want to handle this?" And I loved him very much for not saying anything more than that. I said I needed 1 day. I went to work and I pulled every document I had on my grandfather's estate. I called the notary licensing board. I called the title company. I reached out to my supervising attorney, who listened to the whole thing without interrupting me once, and then said, quietly, "You know what this is, right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you need from me?" I told her. She said, "Done." The next morning, I drove to the bank where my grandfather's estate savings account was held. I sat down with the branch manager. I was the named executor. I had the death certificate, the will, the letters, testamentary, everything. I opened a new estate account under my name and my husband's name as co-trustee. I transferred the $210,000. Then I went to the probate court and filed every document I had, including a flag on the fraudulent loan attempt, which my attorney had already helped me prepare to submit to the county prosecutor's office. I left $12,000 in the original account, enough to look like I hadn't noticed, enough to make them think the door was still open. Then I went home and waited. My husband made dinner. We didn't talk about it much. I watched him move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who has decided that whatever is coming, you two will face it together. And I thought about how different that felt from the family I'd grown up in, where problems were either hidden or weaponized and almost never just carried together. He put a plate in front of me. I ate. I slept. Actually slept. Better than I had in 2 weeks. The text came 4 days later. Transfer went through. We're in Bali. Don't wait up. My brother apparently had made his move and was expecting to land in paradise with our grandfather's money already in his account. I put down the coffee mug. I drove to the office. I pulled the bank notification. I'd set up an alert on the original account for any attempted access. I saw the transfer attempt. I saw the timestamp. I saw that it had bounced against a $12,000 balance instead of the $210,000 my brother had been counting on. I gave them 48 hours. My attorney had advised me to let them process it first, to give them the chance to either come to me or dig themselves deeper. I was betting on deeper. I know my brother. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk reviewing an unrelated estate when my phone lit up with an international number. I recognized the country code. I let it ring twice. Then I answered, "Maya." My brother's voice had that specific edge that I'd grown up hearing, the one that sounds like anger but is actually panic, and the panic is what makes it dangerous. What did you do? I did my job, I said. I'm the executor. I secured the estate assets. That money. He stopped. I could hear noise behind him. The kind of ambient resort sound that you only hear when someone is very far from home and very short on options. That money was supposed to be divided equally. You know, that's what Grandpa wanted. I know what Grandpa wanted, I said. I have it in writing. What I also have in writing is a fraudulent loan application against his 1,967 Mustang. Submitted 2 days after his funeral, notarized at a shipping store by someone who clearly never met him. Silence. I have the document, I said. I have the security footage from the bank branch, which the loan officer already pulled. I have the notary license number, which traces back to a notary who, interestingly, lives in the same county as your wife's college roommate. And I have your cell phone records showing a call to that county at 9:47 p.m. the night before the loan application was submitted, which my attorney obtained through proper channels, because we'd already filed with the prosecutor's office. More silence, longer this time. Then his wife's voice came on, and I knew he'd handed her the phone because he always handed her the phone when things got bad. She was better at pivoting. Maya, she said, warm and reasonable, the way she always was at the start of a negotiation. We can all talk about this like adults. This was a misunderstanding. There's been so much grief, so much stress, and things got handled in a way that looks worse than it is. You know how much we loved Harold. I know how much the Mustang was worth, I said. The loan was for $55,000. The car was appraised at $62,000 when my grandfather insured it last year. You needed fast money. He wasn't here to say no. That's not. I also know, I continued. And I kept my voice completely level because I had been sitting with this for days and I was not going to spend my emotion on a phone call, that the two of you have $38,000 in credit card debt across 4 accounts, that your mortgage is 4 months behind, and that the business you told everyone you were launching actually folded before it ever opened. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because you need to understand that I am not operating on assumptions. I have done my homework. My brother got back on the phone. I could hear his wife murmuring behind him. He said, his voice lower now, stripped of the panic edge and just flat, "What do you want?" This is the question I'd been preparing for. I told him I had 2 options laid out on paper, the same way my grandfather had always approached a hard conversation, clear, written down, no room for later reinterpretation. Option 1. He and his wife returned home. They met with me, my husband, and my attorney. They signed a document relinquishing any claim to contest the estate. In exchange, I would use a portion of the estate funds to pay off the fraudulent loan because even though it was fraud, if it went into default, it would have affected the car's title, which was still in the estate, and I would not pursue criminal charges for the forged signature. They would receive the portion of the estate my grandfather had specified for them in the will, which was $15,000 and the contents of his workshop, no more and no less. Option 2. I filed the criminal complaint in full, pursued a fraud charge on the forged signature, which in our state carried a potential felony, and let the estate be administered entirely through the courts, which would tie everything up for at least 18 months, while also generating a public record that would follow both of them professionally. I heard him exhale. You'd really do that, he said, to your own brother. And here's the thing about being the responsible one in a family. People use that framing against you. They count on the fact that you care about family, that you don't want to be the person who burns it down. They treat your reliability as a leash. They believe, right up until the moment they're proven wrong, that you will always choose peace over justice because the cost of justice is too high for someone like you. What they never account for is what happens when you watch someone exhaust your patience completely. I would, I said, and I will, if that's the direction you choose. They flew back 4 days later. I picked them up from the airport not out of kindness, but because I needed them in the room I'd arranged and I wasn't going to give them the chance to regroup or lawyer up before we sat down. My husband drove. My brother sat in the back seat looking out the window. His wife sat beside him with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Nobody made small talk. Nobody tried. My attorney's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, and she'd stayed late to meet us. She'd set up a small conference room, 4 chairs, a table, 2 folders. She greeted everyone with the professional warmth of someone who has seen this exact situation enough times to have no emotional stake in the outcome, and then she sat down and looked at my brother and said, "Shall we begin?" I slid the folders across the table. My brother opened his. His wife looked at hers but didn't open it. Folder 1, I said, because I had rehearsed this, is the complete accounting of the estate assets, including the transfer I made as executor, which is fully documented and entirely legal. Folder 2 is the evidence file, the loan application, the notary records, the call logs, and the draft complaint my attorney has already prepared for the county prosecutor. My brother looked at the second folder for a long time. He had the expression of a man who has been running a bluff for so long he'd forgotten it was a bluff, and now was sitting at the table being shown everyone else's cards. You need to sign page 7, my attorney said, and initial pages 3, 4, and 11. His wife said, "This isn't fair." My attorney said, "Fairness isn't a legal standard, unfortunately." My brother signed. My sister-in-law sat for another 3 minutes without moving, and then she signed too, and the scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound in the room. We drove home in silence. My husband didn't ask me how I felt until we were inside and the door was closed, and then he just looked at me and waited. And I stood in our kitchen for a minute thinking about my grandfather at his window seat, eating store-bought apple cake every Sunday, still going to the same spot, even after everything that made it meaningful was gone, because he believed in keeping the rituals, even when the people couldn't stay. "I'm okay," I said. And I meant it in the way that okay means not broken, not vindicated exactly, just intact. The estate closed 4 months later. The lake house went to me and my husband that had been in the will, specific and clear, because my grandfather had known, the way people with his particular kind of wisdom always know, which people in his life would actually take care of something. The vintage cars went to auction, which was also specified. The proceeds went into a charitable fund my grandfather had designated for the local Historical Preservation Society because he'd been on their board for 15 years, and he cared more about the covered bridge on Route 9 than most people care about their own money. My brother received his $15,000 and the contents of the workshop, which included a beautiful set of vintage hand tools that he sold within a week. I know because I saw the listing online. That's fine. They were his to do with as he chose. What surprised me, in the months after, was not the anger or the grief or the relief. It was something quieter than all of those. My grandfather had spent his whole life believing that family meant you extended grace indefinitely, that you kept the door open because closing it was a kind of failure. I used to think I agreed with him. I used to carry a version of that belief like a weight I'd never thought to question. But I've come to understand there's a difference between an open door and an unlocked vault. Grace is something you give freely. It doesn't mean you hand someone the key to everything you were trusted to protect and hope they'll do the right thing. Sometimes protecting the people who deserve protection means making a choice that looks, from the outside, like hardness. My grandfather chose me as his executor because he knew I would do what needed to be done, not what was comfortable. Not what kept the peace at the cost of the truth. What needed to be done. The lake house still has the window seat that overlooks the water. I go up most weekends when the weather allows. My husband makes coffee. I sit in the same spot where my grandfather used to sit, with the same view of the dock and the birch trees and the light coming off the cove in that flat, silver way it does on October mornings. I bring apple cake, actual homemade apple cake.